Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Benjamin Niaulin. I'm the VP of Product here at ShareGate. And if you don't know ShareGate, well, we've made ourselves known for migrations to Microsoft 365 and more recently around governance in that same space. Now, today, I want to talk to you about the ever-changing reality of Microsoft 365. And 2026 isn't going to be a business as usual year. Microsoft 365 is changing faster than most teams can keep up. It's a lot. There are four main ways that the changes are piling on, and you know them. First, shipping velocity. In the last year alone, Microsoft says they shipped more than 1,100 features in all of 2025. That's if you count about 3 net new capabilities every day. And before you account for updates and reversals and retirements, and that's a lot. The roadmap is unpredictable. There were also nearly 2,000 public roadmap items. So it's not just the things that are changing fast, which they are, but it's Microsoft's plans that are changing constantly. And us admins have to deal and understand what's coming, review them, adapt, and do the change management with the hundreds of thousands of employees that we may have. And the control plane completely changed. It's an expansion. We're not dealing with simple policies and objects to manage or a new workspace here, a new workspace there. We're talking about Copilot. We're talking about agents talking to other agents that are doing business process and automate the work that we have. In November and December, just those 2 months, 600 plus updates were related to Copilot and agents. The roadmap itself is increasingly written in the language of Copilot and agents, not just new UX and then here and there a new update. It's constantly changing around Copilot and agents. And being responsible for people and devices and the work that happens, we're now also responsible for agents and the data boundaries that they live in. It's a whole new operation layer for us. And of course, the noise, the change noise, whether it's through the message center, a specific app's notifications, your subscription, or some other channel that's hard to stay on top of all these messages, LinkedIn, social networks, everywhere. It's constantly at you. You go to a conference, you go online, there's a new update, a new change, or something you did not know before, which means that predictable changes are not something you can fully engineer or prepare for now. Most teams don't have time to process every update, let alone prepare for the impact. So the technical debt keeps piling up. And people in our organization, in the workplace, continue to create content continuously. They press on the share button, they press on the create button, and that leads to data sprawl, increasing the operational cost for you to manage all of this. And it's not just in dollars, it's time, it's effort. Taken together, this isn't just more change, it's a whole new, different operating climate. Most IT operating models were built to run steady operations, with changes every 3 years or big changes not absorb constant disruptions that are out of your control. So today, in this keynote, we're going to explain why it feels the way that it does and what we can actually do about it. What can you actually do about it? And why IT currently feels so overloaded. Now, there are a lot of disruptions coming in 2026 and 2027. When I say disruptions, I mean significant changes coming from outside of your organization, usually from Microsoft, that affect how your tenant actually operates, but it's so much more than that. Our whole way of working is changing. And these are different from drivers, which I will call more the things that are a little bit more intentional or internal in your organization. Events, pressures, or conditions that could happen that you need to prioritize to get work done for your organization. Disruption changed the landscape. Drivers will influence how your organization responds. Now, we'll cover 3 major disruptions for the next 2 years. And for each one, we'll connect it to the drivers that make it urgent and the action that it implies for you or the team that you work with. First one, let's get the obvious out of the way, AI. AI is accelerating faster than our ability to govern the environment. It's the major storm front that we're facing. AI is accelerating faster. We know this, but what we noticed in our surveys, in last March, 82% of the people answering our survey told us that they've already fully deployed or mostly piloted and implemented Copilot already, or some form of generative AI. I'm willing to bet that that number is completely higher and closer to 100% probably already. AI is embedded across every platform. It's reading content, it's surfacing content, hey, it's even generating content at this point. And so we've never dealt with something at this scale before. But most organizations aren't ready to govern their content in a way that's safe for AI. We're catching up. We knew it was important. We knew we had to do it, but the pace of changes didn't allow us to implement that change just yet. And now we're facing that today. The second disruption that we're facing is around data sovereignty and residency. Those pressures are increasing, whether we're in industries that are heavily regulated or in certain countries and regulations that we just have to abide by. They're not just theoretical or things we should think about. They're here today, and we need to make sure that the architectural massive change is implemented. Those changes are not just huge for you in terms of technology and implementation, but people. In countries like Germany, France, and China, they've already had strict regulations around when the data is stored and how it's accessed. Another disruption, of course, is the end of support waves. If you thought it was just one or two here and there, that list is growing because the pace is growing. From SharePoint 2016 and 2019 servers reaching the end of support in July 2026, to Office Online Server hitting the end of support as well, to the Exchange Web Services, APIs, to so many things that are impacting the way that we work. And not just, again, the technology, but the behaviors and the habits of the people working with Microsoft 365. Because they look to you to make sure that that transition happens as smooth and without friction as possible. In our survey last March, 78% of respondents still had some data on-prem. And in fact, 66% still had critical workloads on premises. That means there's still a lot to move and migrate to the cloud. Or, of course, SharePoint Server Subscription Edition. But clearly, we can tell people are moving to the cloud. And that's another big change. All right, been talking a lot. Let's do a quick check-in. There's a lot of disruptions. And throughout the keynote, we're going to have a few live polls. And I'll make sure to share the results with you afterwards to help you better understand your industry trends, but also where you fit in. Right now, the first question to kick us off is about the disruptions we just talked about. Which one feels like it's going to hit your organization the hardest in the coming year? Is it AI? Is it data sovereignty and residency? Is it the end of support wave that we're facing? Is it all of them? What matters here most is not the disruption that you chose. What matters is that all of them are happening to us in one shape or another in IT across the world, often more than one at the same time. That's why you might feel like you're behind. But the truth is, you're overloaded. There's a lot going on. IT pros today are buried under life cycle debt, gaps in ownership, and expectations that IT will somehow just handle it all. That's why we wanted to host this keynote. Not to just focus on new features that we're announcing, but really to help you understand what's coming, talk to experts, and provide as much clarity into what's happening and how to deal with it. Because we know we can't slow Microsoft down or the world that we live in. We can change how your organization and you prepare for what's coming. So today, we'll talk to you about a few things. How to plan for these big disruptions, the organizational drivers that will shape the actual roadmap that you have, a modern, repeatable operating model for handling nonstop changes, and a peek at our upcoming governance complexity model that you can use to better understand how to govern your tenant more efficiently. Our goal over the next hour is to give you structure, clarity, and a path forward. First, we're going to dig into what these disruptions and drivers look like in the real world and how organizations are responding today. So I want to bring in Niaulin from our community and engagement manager at ShareGate, and he's going to sit down with some of our experts from the community and walk through the forces that are shaping IT roadmaps heading in 2026.
You just heard Ben talk about some of the biggest pressures IT has on its shoulders right now. Now I want to bring those concepts to reality. My name is Niaulin. I am the community engagement manager here at ShareGate. And I wanted to bring in some voices from the field, people who have seen these disruptions happening in real life, inside real tenants with real constraints. So beside me is Drew Niaulin, Microsoft MVP and Microsoft Solutions Architect and Director at Protiviti. Beside him is Joanne Klein, another Microsoft MVP and founder of Next Novus Consulting. And finally, Roger Dominguez, Director, Microsoft Pre-Sales at SHI. What I really love about having all three of you here is that you all bring a different perspective to the ecosystem, different industry, viewpoint, and maturity level. So let's kind of dig in. We'll start broad and we'll kind of narrow it down from there. What feels fundamentally different running Microsoft 365 today versus 2 or 3 years ago?
We've moved from a platform that we administer to one where we need to engineer it. So there's a multi-layered approach of things that you really need to be worried about as far as your data goes. Acceleration of timelines is huge. That's a really good call out, because I'm seeing projects that would have traditionally been 6 to 12 months are now happening in 30 to 90 days, right? And I think that the urgency is coming to the surface thanks to Copilot and AI platforms in general, really bringing to light data that before could be swept under the rug. Now everyone can see what your structure looks like, what your tenant looks like.
If you had to give IT leaders advice, one piece of advice starting in 2026, what would that be?
Leaders, they need to understand that this is not a one-time change. If your tenant's full, you can clean it up, but it's going to fill up again, right? You have to have, in these governance processes, it's a recurring possibility, something that you can do over and over again to maintain this level of governance, not a single point in time for governance. So leaders need to give that breath and understand it will take time and it's not a one-time thing.
No.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point in terms of urgency around turning on AI. And I think staying competitive is something that's in the forefront of a CIO's mind these days. But the traditional kind of approach to saying, hey, we've done, all these things, this project is now complete, let's go ahead and turn it on, that doesn't work anymore. And if you do that, it's going to take you so long to get there that by the time you get there, it's already changed, right? Yeah. So the iterative process of saying, hey, each day we're approaching this and we're doing the things that we used to do as like a quarterly project or a semi-annual project. This is like every single day. Identity, our governance of data, sensitivity labeling, like all of that needs to happen. That's a process that's like a daily process now. It's not something you can just do once a year and then say we're done. So
you don't turn on labels and say we're good.
Right. Yeah.
And do you find, just to touch on that, do you find that when having those conversations with those leaders, going through kind of the process of finding that right solution, that's their number one thing is we just want to mark that as a check and then move on? Or is it, do they understand that governance and this is a consistent, struggle?
Well, I think it's our job to make them understand that. I think for them, they'd like to check the box and say, hey, we've turned on, we're good, right? AI is secure, we can move on to the next task. And it just, doesn't work that way. So really helping them to understand the breadth of what this comprises and how to turn it on in a safe way, but also iterate.
Which disruptions are creating the most urgency right now? Is this end of support deadlines, AI acceleration, sovereignty requirements, or is it something else?
I actually see the biggest disruptions from Microsoft coming down the line of the forced change inside of the cloud that we don't have the reactionary time to support to solve. And you can follow the message center and you might get a message in there that says this is going to change in the next week or two. And you have to adapt to that level of disruption. You don't know it, but they could be deprecating a product in the next week or two or month or two that is going to have an impact. It might just be you, but you have to be ready for a change like that Microsoft is pushing onto you. And the AI side, we are all part of that, but if things go away or things are forcibly changed, the UX changes, especially in general. How we've had many different versions of SharePoint and Teams UXs here over the years and channels, and they're going to keep evolving as they should. And we need to react to those and support that level of disruption that goes beyond just trying to maintain our ongoing governance.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. That, I mean, the pace of change at Microsoft's always been, pretty neck breaking, but in the last couple of years, it's just another step up, really. And obviously, the introduction of Copilot, and if you went to Ignite this last year, I mean, that's the main subject, right? It was like Copilot is the business now, essentially, is what they were trying to communicate. Not true, but it felt that way. So I think that's the biggest disruptor that companies are trying to grapple with is just, how do we implement this? How do we stay secure? What do these changes actually look like internally? How are we going to continue to iterate and develop and really just maintain this platform at the pace that it's moving at? So,
what governance issues does AI kind of surface first? And Joanne, I'll give that one to you first.
Well, two things come to mind. One is, what is the current structure of your environment? So I'll pick on SharePoint and Teams. What kind of state is that in? And in most customers that I work with, it's not good. It's messy, could be, from a lift and shift, from network shares. It could be just no governance. Everybody has, free reign over their cloud environment. Lots of customers in that position. So that makes everything exponentially more complicated to fix. And the second one is that dovetails into all the redundant, obsolete, and trivial rot content that's out there. Many organizations have looked at that by and large as being fairly benign. Yeah, it takes up storage space, but other than that, no harm, no foul. But now that AI has entered the picture, it in fact, it makes for very unclean data hygiene, particularly the obsolete content. So addressing that becomes of primary concern.
It surfaces everything. And I think that's the point, right? So you have AI indexing whatever's there. And so more people have access to see what's there, where historically, again, we were able to sweep this under the rug. I mean, taking 2 steps back into what does your Active Directory look like, right? Like who's actually looked at that in the last 2 to 3 years? And, is it clean, right? So from an identity perspective, it's kind of like, hey, we really need to start at the basics here. We're trying to enable all this super advanced AI stuff, and we're going to do all these fancy things. But then at the end of the day, your kind of basic building block levels of what does your Active Directory look like? What's your identity structure? What's your data look like? What's your sensitivity labeling at? And you have to kind of go back and really do it right because now everyone, CEO, CIO, all the executive suite, they can search, it's indexed, it brings up the results. They're like, what is this, right? I'm seeing all this old stuff. What is that? So the urgency, I think, is because there's more eyes on what's being surfaced through kind of AI and search indexing.
Because everyone's manager field is right in AD, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Which
So
now surfaces that of like, it's interesting to think of the web of how your identity structure is wrong or incorrect or not up to date. And you have obsolete data, which is also not up to date. And that leads to hallucinations and poor value. Mm-hmm. And on the governance side, I think you can, even if you get those right, one of the things that this has been surfacing for me has been the lack of a good governance program has good training and ongoing training. So if you do start to see hallucinations or poor data returns, people need to understand not to trust 100% of everything that's returned at all times.
You talk about hallucinations, and as soon as you started talking about it, it just kind of reminded me that, back in the day where they're like, don't believe everything online. Don't believe everything you read online. It's the same thing. We're back to this again, teaching everyone. It's like, no, don't always trust it. You have to still look at it and figure out what's actually real and not just made up.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Are you seeing organizations plan proactively, or are they still reacting to pressure? Oh, everyone's laughing now.
I see reactive all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all reactive. And so as a consultant, people come to us to be reactive. If I get a call and someone wants to be proactive, like I want to do this, I'd be like, what, really?
That would be shocking. Yeah.
And so the way I want to relate this though is from a maturity model perspective. If you are you're E5, you're fully in the cloud, you've migrated everything. It's very hard to be proactive. Going back to what you talked about originally, Joanne, which is the rate of change that is happening. If you're Greenfield, you can kind of sit back and be like, I can let it come to me. If you are fully invested and your C-suite has bought everything and you are
all in
5 AI platforms that you're running, you can't, it's very hard to be proactive because you are running at the speed of light right now and you can't actually maintain that. So I laugh because the most things I get are reactive because that's where the large organizations are at. There's, to your point, Roger, like they've said, we need to spend money in AI in 26 and 25. So they become reactive to
right.
These smaller firms, these like little ones, they're like, I want to get to AI in this next 6 months. What do we need to do to get ready for it?
So for all the organizations that are firefighting reactively, what can they do?
From an IT leader perspective, or the IT that are thinking or listening about this, is that you need to make sure you look at the way that your team is built, the roles that they're doing, and the actual tasks that they're doing. So if you're using GitHub, or if you're using basically Scrum methodology or some type of methodology for tracking tasks, someone in the leadership perspective needs to look at that, or anyone, and say, how much of this time can I siphon off, and where can I save time to put either it's more bodies or more time into being proactive? So from an organizational structure, from a PM perspective, teams need to find ways to carve out time and say, we will make these processes a priority, and you have to separate the ad hoc support time.
What surprises organizations the most when compliance becomes a driver?
Joanne.
Let's go back to Joanne here for sure. Yeah.
I mean, this has been my world for at least the last 6, 7, 8 years. Is compliance all up has been the laggard, right? It's what brings everybody down, and nobody wants to talk about it, and it's super boring. And I think because of AI, a spotlight has been shone on it, and it's kind of elevated that whole knowledge domain inside an organization. But it comes with challenges too, right? Like IT pros traditionally don't, other than the security side of compliance, don't really understand a lot of the other things. Like they don't really understand records management and all of the regulatory frameworks around that traditionally, from what I've seen. So there's a meeting of the minds, if you will, that has to go on as well with roles across the organization in that.
It's retention for me, what I've seen.
Yeah.
It's the companies I've been the biggest, almost every company I work with, they are not at a maturity level to be able to take records management and realize it. So they retain everything. Every company is on legal hold. Every employee is on legal hold. They keep all their employees' documents for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And what we've come to, where compliance has come, the pain point has been to me, is having records managers try to and IT pros who've just kept everything come together and say, even if you build a retention schedule, you can build it, you can build the labels, you can deploy it, getting the users to understand the impact of that. It's like, I go back to the user side of it, which is the user impact to compliance is really, really big. You can't just go, if I have 500 million documents and I have a record retention schedule and we want to clean up our data because our tenant's full, but we have compliance requirements to keep data for 7 years based on our client data, based on the client requirement. How can you identify what a client file is? And it's easy to say, you can still do it technically, and compliance can still define that. But then bringing that to the user to say, okay, now you need to go figure that out. Like you need to go figure out which ones you need to keep, and then we can go delete. So you can still have IT pros and compliance get together and come up with the best governance strategy.
Yeah.
But the implementation of that takes so long, and I'm seeing stagnation there, where I could deploy anything you want, train everyone that you want. And if they don't action on that, you just don't understand the impact of that from compliance or why to label something.
Right.
It's just a technical gap. It's just a technical control without a follow through.
Yeah.
When organizations try to modernize today, what tends to slow them down the most? People, process, or the state of the tenant itself?
Subsites.
Oh yeah, turn those off.
I'm serious. That's more tangential.
It's actually could be true.
The state of the tenant is a huge issue, but you can't even if you fix it, if you don't have the people and the processes in place, you're just going to end up in that same state again. So I hate to say it, but you got to fix all three problems. Mostly the tenant, get it in a state that's good, and then the process and the controls around it, and then the people part of it. Sometimes it might be a change in behavior, or they have to put things in a different place, or you are going to impact humans at the end of this. I get so many compliance teams coming to me saying, we just want to implement this and we don't want to affect any of our business users. I don't know how to do that. I honestly don't. And I know the controls fairly well in the back end. We are going to impact them to varying degrees. So it's going back to that stakeholder group, I suppose, deciding what it is we want to do and what is the impact. Hopefully minimally, but there will be some kind of impact.
For me, it is a variable, but specifically talking about AI, I think it is a behavioral change for all of us, right? Where that we were used to kind of technological changes. You're moving from, one CRM system to another, or, you're kind of retraining someone on a platform of how to use software, where now it's like, no, we're changing the way that you approach your day-to-day activity, right?
I say people. So
yeah.
I think you say all three. You say business and the kind of the user impact, and that I'd say I completely agree. The impact of change has been more acceptable, but it is still the largest area of opportunity or enforcement that I want to have out there, because we do have more reign to allow people to make these changes but it doesn't stop us from building better communication and having better ongoing options for this.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. The environment we're working in is changing incredibly fast. Before we discuss how to change the way we work in these environments, let's take a look at how this reality can sometimes feel like. Oh, come. Here they are in their natural habitat, the modern IT pro. Once a predictable environment, Microsoft 365 has evolved rapidly. Updates now arrive frequently and in large numbers. Notice the IT pro's expression. Slumped shoulders. The foot tapping anxiously. If we watch long enough, we may see it. Yes, the signature forehead rub. This is what's known as update fatigue. The IT pro is adapting to deal with such changes. We observe this new learned behavior. The use of a new tool, AI. Like the crow that crafts a tool to reach hidden grubs, AI helps the IT professional reach deeper and faster into their tenant. Watch how it surfaces answers at previously unheard of speeds. Easily missed by the untrained eye. We could see that not all it uncovers is helpful. It can also reveal sensitive or misleading information. And in this environment, mistakes are costly. Further adaptation must follow. When the environment becomes unstable, survival behaviors emerge. The IT pro must establish boundaries to protect their territory. This is not a form of aggression or dominance. This is self-preservation and altruism. These boundaries protect the group. They reduce risk. They preserve energy. A stable environment is reclaimed. Balance is restored, one setting at a time.
Hi, I'm Richard Harbridge, a Microsoft MVP, and I'm excited to talk about operational frameworks and Microsoft 365 governance models today. And I'm joined by industry expert and fellow Microsoft MVP, Drew.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Drew Niaulin. I'm a longtime Microsoft MVP, just like Richard, and work with a lot of different organizations around deploying and managing Microsoft 365 at scale.
Awesome. Now, Microsoft 365 is designed to evolve continuously. New capabilities, retirements, policy surfaces, and many admin portals. Microsoft's own guidance basically says the hard part isn't knowing change is coming, it's keeping up and knowing what to act on. All of this is to say disruptions and organizational drivers are going to keep reshaping our Microsoft 365 roadmaps. And you can't control when they show up, but you can control how you respond. Today, we're going to explore how an operational layer framework and governance model gives teams a consistent, repeatable way to respond without waiting for emergencies or letting risk quietly build up. If you used ITIL continual improvement or the classic plan, do, check, act loop, well, you're used to operating in frameworks, and this will feel familiar. What we need to do is translate proven improvement cycles into Microsoft 365 operational language so it's simple enough to run every month, but strong enough to handle surprises. So let's start by naming the layers of Microsoft 365 management. There's a distinction between these layers. There's the control layer. That's where configurations allow us to enforce how Microsoft 365 works. Then on top of that, there's this policy layer. That's where we intend to be true, the rules and outcomes we're aiming for. And policies use controls to help enforce them. Lastly, there's this important layer at the top, and that's how we keep it true. It's the recurring work that absorbs change, prevents drift, and keeps sprawl from becoming normal. Each layer uses the layer below, and most organizations have controls and policies, but what they're missing is that operational engine that keeps those policies and controls from quietly decaying. Now, day-to-day work in Microsoft 365 often happens in that operational layer. Reviewing platform and usage changes, disruptions and drivers, that happens there. Managing workspace creation, lifecycle, cleaning up rot, reviewing permissions and sharing, and more are all examples of taking actions that improve Microsoft 365 from the operational layer. Now, Drew, there are many challenges when it comes to Microsoft 365 operations. What are some of the biggest challenges that affect that operational layer and that might help people understand what to do about it?
Absolutely. So what I want to start with is actually making sure we understand what the policy, control, and operational layer and how they work together. So I want to start with an example that is very ripe in this AI scenario world today, which is going to be around lifecycle management. So you have a world where we have a lot of sites, a lot of teams, a lot of sprawl, and we have controls in place that we can start to remove those things. You have policies that say who should remove them and how they should be removed. How often should we review the life cycle of these sites? At the operational layer, you need to say how often these need to be done and how does that go across Microsoft 365 as a whole, rather than just saying these sites need to expire after 3 days or 3 months, let's say. Now, where that comes into knowing that that's a clear example, where I see these expand daily and operational side is more around migrations and integrations and modernization work that are happening across that platform, that are happening across Microsoft 365. And so if you have a migration, how does that then affect the policies that you have for site lifecycle? How does that affect the controls that were put in place to automatically remove those after a certain period of time? Or if you're bringing in a third-party integration, those are going to be handled at an operational layer to make the decision when they're coming in. And you need to have a repeatable way because they're going to keep happening. So that's how I think a good example of by being more specific between the control, the policy, and the operational layer, that you have these other things that happen like modernization, but the exact example makes it easier to understand of why an operational layer is important.
Now, when we see this showing up across different organizations, it does show up in different ways. And that can slow your team down when it's doing something like migrations or modernization. Lack of time or resources, unclear ownership, uncontrolled sprawl, and missing or outdated governance. So we actually have a live poll for all of you right now, so you can tell us which of those things is the most common or most painful part of managing and leading Microsoft 365 today. Any successful operating framework for Microsoft 365 must be continual, but it also has to be built around 3 things. A signal intake, that's what changed. An operational backlog and decision log, that's what we're doing and why. Now, this second one is important. It's a stable, repeatable operating structure, and it needs to reduce decision fatigue by giving teams a consistent way to decide what gets attention each cycle, even if inputs are changing. The third one is a baseline or exception register. This is what in control means and what's temporarily different. You need all 3. Most teams run these on a monthly operating cycle with a quick weekly triage for anything urgent. The point is, change gets handled in a rhythm, not by adrenaline or in a project. Now, we need to define the operating cycle. Today, we're going to describe it as review, where are we now and what changed? Decide, where do you want to be and how do we get there? Act, what targeted operational work will we do this cycle? And then validate, Did we reduce risk and avoid drift? And are we still aligned with our baseline? Now, this isn't a one-time process. It's a cycle that teams run on a regular cadence. The steps repeat even as inputs are changing. All right, let's dive into review because I think that's a really important one. Now, teams deliberately take in signals like platform updates for emerging risks. I'm thinking message center, roadmap, service health, usage, those types of things. Now, Drew, I know you work a lot in reviews with customers at scale. What are some of the key things that they drive in the review cycle?
Thank you. So one of the things I see in review, or I'd say a few things I see that are very important, is going to be understanding where that signal is coming from. So if you are going to have a signal coming from your security team, that might be a different way of response versus if you have a signal coming from an audit versus if you have a signal coming from simply the C-suite saying, I want to have this type of change come through. How does that manage? How are you guys going to get that done? So you have to manage and triage those changes or you have to review those decisions or those actions coming through in a way that can be handled and maintained by your team. So when you're looking at this from an operational layer, you're going to have you have all these different things coming in. You need to have the right people and have the time to sit back and understand of where it matters to my organization. Because simply because Microsoft says something or there's a best practice out there, that does not mean that it is most important for you. So review that to say, is that a disruption I care about? Is that a review I need to worry about? Is it an emergency? So you need to triage that in a way and then put that back into the backlog state to say, this is a higher priority in the backlog. Then by having that curated backlog around Microsoft 365, you can start to delineate and say, this is something that I need to get it done at some point, and know that if there's an impact of, let's say, an M&A or an action that's much larger, that will dictate how my backlog is built. So the signal with the review cycle, you need to have a place to put them.
Yeah.
And it's not simply taking one review at a time. It's how do those reviews affect each other?
And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next is decide. Because once you've done that review, you have to make the choice on what matters most for your organization right now. Not every change, driver, or disruption needs immediate action. So maybe you could use a simple rubric: impact, urgency, and reversibility. If the change is high impact and hard to undo, it gets attention now. If it's low impact or easily reversible, it goes into the backlog. I think that reversibility is really important because a lot of times we have changes that we have to make, but some of them are really consequential. We're worried about the impact of it because it's harder to kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube. If we're already seeing drift, oversharing, unresolved exceptions and sprawl, then the cycle might prioritize getting back to baseline before we accelerate anything new. And I've seen that quite a bit where, sometimes organizations have a bunch of new stuff they want to do, but they're like, hey, we have hygiene issues. Like we have real problems here. And at some point we have to address these. And so maybe that's the right time to flag it and say this cycle, maybe we, just for a month or whatever, we delay some of these other things to create some room for us to resolve these issues. I see that a lot with data hygiene for AI projects as an example. Now, act is important, and taking action is the next stage. At this stage, you should start doing targeted time-bound work that's focused on reducing risk or drift. This is where teams often get tripped up because act doesn't mean launching a big program or trying to fix everything, as you just said, right? It's about choosing a small number of actions that actually reduce risk or drift this cycle. And go back to a decision, they have to be pragmatic, real, and things you can actually execute. Being deliberate about what you're not doing yet is important. Now that brings us to validate, which is exactly the step that most teams skip. That's usually because they're already pressured to move on. But this is where we catch the quiet failures, exceptions that became permanent, sharing defaults that drifted, workspaces that never got cleaned up. Nothing moves forward unless the environment's still in control. And validation isn't just about proving perfection, it's about proving you didn't make things worse, right? In like that example. So confirming the Microsoft 365 operational investments we're making are working can be hard, but it's really important. So when teams struggle to modernize and improve how they operate Microsoft 365, it's usually not because they don't know what to do. They struggle because change shows up constantly in a series of emergencies. And using a framework replaces adrenaline with rhythm. So decisions get made deliberately, less reactively. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds great as long as nothing changes, but it works even when your organization is undergoing huge changes like reorgs, M&As, and more. These high pressure moments are usually when teams abandon structure But with an operational layer framework or model, it's about establishing those standards before the pressure hits, not scrambling to invent them when it does. And those disruptions are becoming more common, so we should proactively start to build that surface now. Disruptions are going to come up during the review, and organizational drivers determine how much we accelerate, deepen, or narrow the cycle. But once the operating cycle is in place, the platform can keep changing and you won't lose control. It's no longer how do we handle change, but where should we spend our limited time and effort? And that's what I'll unpack next as we dive deeper into governance complexity and risk. Once teams can operate in a rhythm, the challenge shifts. Up to this point, we've been talking about operating frameworks because a solid operating framework gives you consistency. But if you've ever thought, we have the rhythms and policies, so why does this feel still hard? Well, you're not alone. That gap is because Microsoft 365 governance is complex. Here's a simple way to define it. Governance complexity is the ongoing effort required to keep governance working as conditions change, without creating friction, drift, or incidents. So complexity isn't a judgment. It's not you're immature or you're doing it wrong. It's contextual. Two organizations can follow the same best practices, and one will sustain them with more ease, while the other can feel like they're constantly fighting the environment, because complexity increases when scale is high. More sites, more teams, more guests, more policies, more admins, more complexity. AI can be a perfect example of how complexity can spike faster. The work, permissions, sharing, and content sprawl may not be new, but AI can amplify the impact they have overnight. Suddenly, access that was technically allowed becomes access that's higher risk, more visible, and operationally more urgent to address. Time for another check-in. Which governance area feels the hardest to sustain over time in your organization? All right. If it was hard to choose one area, well, you're not alone. Governance is hard, but if we break it down, we can make it easier. Let's start by reminding ourselves that complexity is not the same as risk or maturity. Risk is the consequence of something going wrong. And complexity is how hard it is to prevent it from happening and to keep that prevention running. Maturity is how disciplined and consistent your approach is. And there's great frameworks for Microsoft 365 maturity we can use. But complexity also needs to be understood. You can be mature and still be in a highly complex environment. You can be low risk in some areas, but high in complexity in others because the operational load could be heavier. If you understand where complexity is higher, you can better predict and prioritize where to invest. When it's higher, it becomes harder to sustain. And that's where teams burn time. That's where policies drift. That's where incident volume grows. Governance in Microsoft 365 is multidimensional. Different governance areas experience different demands and challenges. If you were to break Microsoft 365 governance down into categories, there'd be 31 governance categories. All of them are important, and they all need to be addressed across 9 domains. There's a high danger of collapsing or oversimplifying complexity. If instead we show it in a more comprehensive way, in a governance profile, it can help us understand what the complexity concentrates around, why certain areas feel heavier than others, what trade-offs we're dealing with across governance areas. You see, every workload has governance complexity, but not all workloads have the same shape. And understanding that shape with more detail means we can better prioritize the right investments in our Microsoft 365 operational layer. But what's important is that even if you're only focused on one workload like SharePoint, it's interconnected. You can't just deal with the complexity of, say, permissions and granularity without also understanding how identity and lifecycle of users like guest users influence how people access information. Governing permissions is only part of governing access. Surprisingly, a great many of these areas of governance compound and connect with one another. You can see that they all map a little differently, but share complexity. Each of the other workloads, doesn't matter which one it is, has complexity that can be understood and identified. So while they're really complex together, when broken down, you can see what drives that complexity and better understand how to best address it. That understanding is critical. Beyond the challenge of understanding where complexity lives, though, is the fact that complexity isn't static. A heavily regulated organization will experience complexity differently than an unregulated one. A team mid-migration, moving away from a legacy on-prem environment, they're going to feel different pressures than a cloud-native one. Multi-geo organizations will have very different constraints than an SMB without residency concerns. That's why our governance models need to be designed to make context visible. So you're not comparing yourself to some generic benchmark. Instead, you need to compare your complexity drivers to your operational reality. Say you're a small or mid-sized organization, but you acquire another company and it's more highly regulated. Well, now you have to deal with the M&A migration as well as new regulations. It means your scale has changed. Think of changes as these important drivers in operating conditions as amplifiers. Larger scale means more complexity. More assurance and regulations means higher complexity as well. This means that SharePoint governance complexity before an acquisition is going to be different than after it. It changes over time. This doesn't change SharePoint, but the governance complexity around it. And this is true for all the workloads across many categories. Earlier, we mentioned that governance is interconnected. If you tighten external sharing, you'll decrease the risk of exposure, but you'll increase friction around exceptions. Similarly, if you create a policy around mandatory labeling, you'll increase compliance, but your training burden and possible overrides and exceptions go up. Reducing complexity in one area can spike complexity in another. That's fine if you know what's going to happen, if you understand those things. But these decisions about prioritization are much harder if you don't understand their impact. This is where governance stops being about rules and starts being about judgment. Every decision shifts the burden somewhere else: risk, friction, training, or operational effort. The goal isn't to completely eliminate trade-offs, it's to choose the ones that make sense for your organization right now. But that doesn't mean there's no way to mitigate trade-offs and address these challenges. Reducing the amount of manual effort required to keep governance running, that's an important one. And an obvious way to do that is by using purpose-built tools. The goal here isn't to automate governance decisions, it's to make discovery faster, decisions clearer, and execution safer, more reliable, so teams can keep operating in rhythm without burning out. And something like ShareGate Protect can make a big difference there. Another way to address these issues is to use what we're going to call control packages. Now, control packages are basically activities you do for governance, but we wrap them together because they're done together, either recurringly or as a foundational configuration and setup motion. Each of these represents a specific governance problem area. And for each one, there's a defined set of strategies the team can apply. The goal isn't to invent governance from scratch in every area, but to start with proven patterns and adapt them to your context. One example could be external collaboration and sharing. It impacts governance categories across multiple workloads. The values in the structure. You see, for each area, we're explicitly identifying what the definition of done or good enough looks like. Not just the end state, but what's acceptable at different stages. By doing that, it means that when we take those actions, we can determine if it's complete, at least this phase of governance, this cycle, this operating cycle, going back to our operational framework. We also separate one-time setup and recurring tasks. That means that our team knows what they're signing up for to sustain. And that distinction matters because most governance pain comes from recurring work that no one planned for. And finally, we define what evidence to capture. So you can prove control and policies are working, spot drift early, and avoid rebuilding this every audit cycle. Naturally, this fits with our previous operating framework. We're using the same ideas here. Again, the details will vary by organization, but this is the level of clarity that makes governance sustainable instead of aspirational. You can understand and tackle governance complexity, and we can help by sharing an interactive model of governance that you can use. And everyone who signed up for this event, keep an eye on your inbox for that. If you answer a short set of questions about your organization and the disruptions and drivers you're facing, you can get a personalized breakdown of where complexity is highest, what's driving it, and practical ways to reduce complexity so your team gets back time and bandwidth. But we don't want you to leave empty-handed today. So we're also sharing a governance checklist aligned to these same areas so you can take action immediately, even before an interactive model is available, that will help you prioritize your governance planning. In the next section, Ben is going to talk about how you lead and do that with commitment.
Thanks, Richard. A lot of good info in there. Now, we need to shift from models to mindset. Tools only work when leaders commit to using them, and we know this. This section is a short operating charter teams can adopt for 2026. Now, commitment number one I would recommend is work in cycles, not emergencies. I know, it's easy to say, harder to do. The only constant in Microsoft 365 is change. We can't stop that. So I would reinforce the importance of a predictable operating cadence. Acknowledge that disruptions will keep coming, but having constant cycles creates that space for better decisions, low stress, and a sustainable progress. Cycles don't prevent disruptions. They prevent disruptions from dictating how you're going to work, how IT works. Now, the second thing I'd recommend is make governance part of normal operations. Governance isn't a one-time project or a phase or a milestone. It's recurring. It's all the time. It's operational. When governance is deferred, risk accumulates quietly, and then governance is a harder thing to manage. It needs to be embedded, and then risk is a whole lot easier to manage. Emphasize that governance has to be part of how work gets done. It's not something that should be layered on afterwards. It's part of the day-to-day. It's part of how we do things. Now, the third thing I'd recommend is prioritization. And I know that well. It's my work day in and day out. It's hard. Everything seems urgent. And based on the contents that you have, it can feel like noise. So you need to learn to prioritize and put the things in place to help you prioritize. Disruptions and drivers will compete for attention, but not every signal deserves immediate action. So teams need permission to focus deliberately on governance and avoid trying to fix everything at once. Use the complexity model that was shared in your org-specific context, like industry, geography, your AI deployment stage, and to guide your focus and decisions. Prioritization is key. There will be trade-offs, but they are necessary. Saying yes to some things and later to others is an act of leadership. It helps you get work done, but it also enables you to be a better leader. This will give you greater confidence in decision-making, clearer communications with stakeholders, more sustainable use of the time and expertise in your team, and reduced operational whiplash and a sense of direction. Despite the constant change. Microsoft 365 will keep changing, but that doesn't mean chaos is inevitable. You can still have clarity through these changes. Use the operational layer framework, use the governance checklist, and keep an eye out for the governance complexity model when we release it in March. And if you want some help making potential risk in your tenant more easily visible, if you want insights or recommendations for what to do next in your environment, well, ShareGate Protect is here for you. Simply connect with a free trial and get a free M365 governance risk assessment. Get visibility on what's happening in your tenant and recommendations right now. Now, we've shared a lot of information and you probably have a ton of questions. Our crew is here, I'm here, so let's dive into your questions and see how we can help.
Amazing. Well, this was a phenomenal keynote, and I am now joined by our experts and staff at ShareGate. So we wanted to kind of answer your burning questions that you had during the this keynote, and we have a few, and we're really excited to answer them. So I know we have a few minutes still to answer them, so I'm going to jump right on in if everyone's okay with that. I should mention, yes, we are joined, of course, by Drew, Joanne, Roger, Richard, and Ben. So got the whole crew today. So let's start right off the bat. This question is for Joanne. The question is, I read about solutions for cleaning up data in her blog. How can we clean up the environment without purchasing additional licenses?
Okay. Well, one of the first questions I ask is in fact about licensing, because that, like it or not, will impact the options available to you. The addressing rot, which was mentioned a lot in the keynote and in Richard's commentary, there are technical controls and purview to do that you can get with an E3 in data lifecycle management, but I would never suggest in the real world that alone is sufficient. There's risk in just blindly getting rid of content, after a certain period of time. It has to be done in tandem with identifying your records of value and applying more targeted intentional controls to them. So it ends up becoming a licensing discussion to some degree, just because of the purview controls that you're going to need, in my opinion, to put on top of that, particularly if you're in a regulated organization.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so now this is kind of open to everyone. Anyone can jump in on these, similar to the round table. But how do we specify the operational costs into real dollars to translate to the C-suite? Who wants to try and take that one? It's a fun one.
I'll add a comment if no one else will. One of the things that I always think of is it doesn't have to be real money. So sometimes I find organizations struggle because we don't track all of this effectively. And so, funny money, share bucks, whatever you want to call them, there's other ways you can track it. I think the key, what you're trying to show is that there are spikes, right? There are activities, there are choices within the organization that have an influence. They have an associated cost with them. And it reminds me, in the earlier question with Joanne, we were highlighting how do we, apply this, compliance at scale, those types of things. I think of that challenge of a lot of people looking at, at whether it's operational, whether it's governance, whether it's compliance, they look at it as this insurance. And you pay it, and you're paying for it for when something goes wrong. You're paying to reduce the risks and things like that. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. A lot of times, it is about efficiencies, it's about performing better, and it's about how you're getting more out of those investment dollars that you're spending in operational frameworks. However, I will highlight that you can still use that advantage as well. So I've seen organizations where, using, funny money, fake dollars, what they'll do is they'll say, hey, we're doing this, think of like board level or very senior leadership reviews around departments and regions. And as they're talking about like spend and efficacy, they might say, well, hey, this area is using Dropbox and this area is using a number of, we'll call them unsanctioned file sharing tools, which is fine. We, of course, as an organization need to support the efficacy of the business, but those things have a cost because IT can't just let those things run. So they have to run all this additional monitoring. They have to do all this additional reporting. They have to do, these migrations. They have to plan ahead of time to deal with those migrations and all this other stuff. So there's all this associated cost, and all IT is doing, or in this case, the funny money, is that they're just showing that there is a cost. And so then that makes a bit of pressure internally to represent, do we need this? Do we need this, 6 AI solutions that all do the same thing? Do we need, this other thing? And yes, people want them, but it becomes at least more visible to everyone that we're making trade-offs, that we're making those decisions. So I think, that's one way I think you can operationally cost it a little bit. If you're, you're lucky and your organization's got a lot of maturity there, then of course you're going to have like revenue cost transfers and other things at a good level. But if you don't have that, even just these like funny money style discussions where you can kind of say that there is this associated cost, even if it's indirect, I think can really help elevate the discussion at those executive briefings and opportunities to create the change that you want, which often requires multiple leaders to agree.
I'll jump in with one of that one, Jalen. I think it's important to note what Richard said and what Richard and I talked about during this is that as part of operational management, one of the things to understand and organize is how you're spending your time as an IT engineer, IT pro, and we talked about being reactive and proactive. Are you doing something that is operationally ongoing for your organization? Or are you doing something that is a fire drill, that is a service certificate, that is something that you need to do to keep the lights on? And if you can find a way to separate those and organize those, that's how you can start to divvy up the time. So I don't necessarily look at it as dollar values for cost, for savings. I look at it as hourly savings or human savings for the time that we're doing. So if I'm spending 78% of my time, 90% of my time on just keeping the lights on, and what Richard was talking about for operationally maintaining these different systems, then I only have 10% of my time available to be proactive and actually doing something beyond just this operational layer. So if you think about the task tracking that you're using, the tools that you're using for managing those time, your hours, and then you can correlate that at the executive level to say, I'm spending, my IT team of 50 people is spending X amount of hours doing this in a sprint, in a wave, however you track that. And and then you can try to equate that to dollars, but equate that to human hours or the effort we have as an IT team.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, thank you. So I want to This might be for Roger. Let's see. Roger, tell me if this is.
Okay.
How do we influence leaders to ensure their teams are deleting old content, or how do we get them to accept our firm retention policies? Is that something you'd answer?
Yeah, sure. I can take a crack at it. So, depending on the framework, right? So you have different organizations that have to adhere to different policies, right? Like whether you're in healthcare or insurance or you're a law firm, there's going to be certain kind of minimum requirements you have to meet from a retention perspective, right? So those are what they are. I think it can get really interesting around how much of that data really needs to be kind of hot versus cold, and some storage solutions that you have today, especially in SharePoint, where you can really move a lot of the older data that you don't need every day into cold storage. But I think enlightening leadership to those options is something that will probably move the needle, right? I think a lot of executives are just like, hey, we have a HIPAA policy. We got to keep stuff for 10 years. Like, just dump everything into a bucket and keep it, is not necessarily getting the best value out of M365, right? I think you can do a lot more there. So to me, it's just showing them the possibilities, some of the options that we have in M365 today, and then enlightening them as to like, look how much money we can save, right, from a storage perspective, or maybe some of this data we're just not using that much, and then when you hit that cliff of your necessary retention periods, having your retention policies and reviewing your retention policies with leadership, not only are you going to kind of stay on top of it yourself because you're going to have to present that to them, but you're going to let them know what's actually possible. So.
Excellent. I want to mention we are probably going to run slightly over for the Q&A, but for those of you who are attending, this is going to be available on demand, so not to worry, you will still be able to see these answers later. Okay, I'm going to bring this to Richard. So this is kind of regarding the complexity model. How is each area rating determined on the target graphs?
So that there are a lot of visuals that we didn't put into this because there wasn't enough time. Each of the categories, like all 31 categories, have their own score, and then that score has different amplifiers, so those drivers can change, so scale, like different types of considerations, and then those are tied to questions, and then based on answers to those questions as well as data that you can retrieve using tools or other techniques, you can then put that together, and then you'll get like a sense of your complexity. So that's kind of like how we've done it. The ones that were shown in those examples were based on preliminary model design, where it does a lot of those things. So yeah, the biggest thing I think to take away from how we calculate it is that, in your own organization, a lot of times I see a lot of organizations say, well, governance is this, and we all have a perception of it, right? So governance is just some policy. It used to be a document that no one read, right? It would be something that we'd frame a certain way. And now what we're acknowledging is that in the AI era and the current era, governance is powering a lot of the experiences and the success of organizations. And so understanding it and breaking it down a little bit more can allow for organizations to see where there might be areas where they're really underestimating the complexity of governance and there's not clear owners, or there's areas of governance where they want to achieve a certain level of maturity, right? They want to be at this level as an org. And so we need to understand that means that these areas are going to take more investment than other areas, depending on the workloads. Think of like the differences between Exchange and SharePoint or things like that. So again, the big takeaways here is we will be providing a lot more. There is this amazing, checklist resource that you can use that has a lot of the breakdowns, and those checklist items are really giving you a sense of where that complexity is, and then we'll have more materials and resources to help people. But if you have your own ideas on where those categories are, or where some of those things might be off, we'd love to have more discussions around it as well and get feedback and kind of work with the community on this resource.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's a similar question here, and maybe you answered it already, but what is riskier in your governance model? Users not tagging, or users being forced to tag and going to other platforms to work around?
Interesting. I definitely have an answer for this, but I'd love to hear, Joanne or Roger or Drew, if you guys have an opinion on this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to quantify, right? It's like a really good question. To me, I think that if you are, really leaning in and trying to leverage M365, that, I wouldn't say you're forcing users to tag, but really kind of it goes back to that behavioral change, right? Where, when you send an email, you're given a couple tags to choose from. You choose one to send it, and kind of that behavior becomes ingrained. So I know the question is a good one because, yeah, true. Like if I have to do extra steps, let me just shortcut and go to that other app. But the whole point is we're giving you one channel to go through. Let's bring everything into the M365 platform. And that's really the way that we're able to govern, right? And that comes, whether it's Copilot or, SharePoint or, things like that, you have to integrate into one. Otherwise you lose control.
And I'll add one to that on Roger here, which is if you, it depends. It's a good question because it depends on the outcome, like what we're looking to do. And if we're talking data security and exponentially exfiltration of data, then it's absolutely the second option, which is people labeling content and then going around that labeling or going around that for a reason, which can be as simple as we have an encrypted piece of information or a label that says it's sensitive, and then I need to try to move it to my personal device because I think I need to work at home for it, right? So then I email it to myself, and then I now have it on my personal device, and let's say I lose it, right? That is riskier from a data security perspective because they're going around things, policies that they've already put in place. The first one with not labeling, that it's like a different risk because the risk of that is not knowing that that data is leaving. It's not knowing that that data is moving around. So my first inclination was that the second one is much worse, is a worse place to be in because people are moving things or at least have the capability to do it, but you can identify that. You have a way then, I think of an operational side of when you have labeling, you need to have a process that is a review process of how data is moving in and outside of your organization based on those labels. So in a mature organization, you have a way to see if people are labeling stuff incorrectly and moving it, then maybe we have a problem with our labels or our data classification policy. So you can at least identify that. And the first one, you have no idea. Yeah. So I'd rather, what I tell organizations is some labeling is better than none because I can at least figure out something based on that. But you need to be aware of the risk that you're putting in play by putting that in. If you do labeling without proper governance and understanding of the user's impact, that has to be why a labeling project we do takes, I've talked to Joanne, we can turn labeling on in 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. It can take a year plus to actually be very effective inside of an organization as it matures. So that's a great question, and it kind of rough both ways. But data security, I lean to moving stuff inappropriately.
Yeah.
I'll only add that default labeling is way easier in Microsoft 365. And, it's a space where you're investing typically in information architecture and things like that. So if you can combine that together, you tend to get a better result than, when you isolate it. So, DLP, all these other things are exceptions. When it goes in another system, you often do lose more control. Like you don't have the same level of, governance capability. And so I would definitely encourage defaults in Microsoft 365 first and foremost. Yeah.
I would also add that many of the tools in Purview are really able to identify where maybe some of that activity is going on, that risky activity. So data security posture management is taking a look at that. And there are, of course, controls you can put in place. But identifying, if you haven't already done so, but from those tools, you will start to see very early where those risky activities are happening. And some of them may be legitimate business needs, right? So identifying what your data at risk scenarios are is the underpinning for being able to really tweak your classification scheme and your labeling scheme such that it doesn't impede legitimate business processes. And that takes a while, but I think that that's necessary for any organization to be able to function with these controls in place.
Amazing. Thank you. Only a few questions here left. This one I really like. The question is, we can't influence senior leaders. How can we, as admins, work to do what's best for our tenant? find that can be a fun one to jump into.
So as someone who's been an IT pro, that's what I started my career as, and I understand that pain of I have a tenant and I need to do something with it, or back then I had SharePoint on-prem. Like what I look at is how to empower, coming up with strategies to empower the data owners or data stewards more that don't require executive approval. So the theme of some of the things you're talking about has been data cleanup, data labeling, data management. If we do things around site lifecycle, we're empowered. You don't really, I would say, you don't necessarily need executive approval. If we're just going to say, trigger something that says we want to archive inactive teams. I'm not getting rid of content, so we shouldn't have a legal control. It's not going away. We might need a calm communication, but we are communicating this in a way of we are improving our tenant governance. It's not breaking anything. It's not removing anything. We are simply making it cleaner for people to find content going forward. So when you're looking at this from an exec approval, try to find ways that you can empower the owners from access reviews, data lifecycle management reviews, that there's no downstream, there's no necessarily reason, in my opinion, to go to an admin for that or an executive for that. And I also say at certain points, there are areas where you can start to press and ask for forgiveness more than ask for approval in certain areas. If you see growth, right, you can say, you're not going to break anything, you're going to move anything. Just like, yeah, I turned it on for 50 people. I wanted to make sure it happened. Are we good? Can I keep going? You kind of start moving forward. But I think the training data owners is more important than initially more important than gathering exec feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd add to that. I think it's hard as an admin because we're speaking a different language from like an M365 administration perspective to an executive team, or your upline manager who's making that decision. And so if everything's kind of outcome based, right? Like if what you're trying to do is minimize risk without like killing the productivity of the end user, you're trying to make the remote work secure. Basically, you're really trying to drive adoption and leverage as much as you can out of an M365 license cost. And so being able to translate that and show that to your leaders, where you have users, you have use cases, and you kind of have these KPIs of like, well, if we do this and we allow for more secure work, and leverage everything we have within the M365 license, we're going to get better ROI, right? So that's going to have better impact and I think drive the decision you're looking for from a leadership perspective. Because if you go in and you tell them like, hey, we need to enable all this stuff, and we need to have like all these DLP policies in place, and we need to do conditional access policies, they get lost, right? They're not understanding what we're talking about. But if we show them like where we're trying to get to, obviously we're going to have a better result.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I'll just highlight that cost thing's huge, right? Sometimes it doesn't need to be that executive or leadership discussion, because we can make the cost cheaper and make it more actionable. And if we can do that, then it can be done at a lower level or iteratively, So yeah, don't give up. You can always find ways to communicate up, but reducing cost and making it more actionable can make a big difference too.
Amazing. Now, someone we haven't heard from yet, who's been hiding, is Ben. Ben is here. We do have a question for you, Ben.
Yep.
We have someone asked, when will we see the automation option back in ShareGate Protect?
Yes, that's actually coming out very soon. The team's working on it right now. So, I mean, a month or two. I'll be a classic product guy. I'll add an extra month. Let's say in the next 3 months, we'll get the automations back in, and we'll follow through with access reviews and site attestations and so on and so on.
Fantastic. Awesome. Yeah, and it is something we've had a question in other webinars as well. So we're happy to be able to have you here to actually say it. Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, the only thing left was this. Someone asked where we can find the book on M365 best practice, and that in the checklist that Richard actually referred to. You will actually be getting that emailed to you along with the recording. So be on the lookout for that. But that is time. So at this point, we want to thank everyone for joining us and seeing this keynote. I want to thank all of our experts for joining. Joanne, Roger, Drew, Richard, Ben, thank you all for joining us throughout and helping put this together. It was an incredible opportunity. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our everyone who attended. We really appreciate it. We hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And we look forward to chatting with you more online through LinkedIn and all other sorts. We'll see you soon. Bye now.